Welcome back to my channel, everyone! Alright, without further ado, let us dive straight into the recap of Spirit Chronicles Volume 28 Part 2. Alright guys, in the previous video we saw the major consequences of Rio's decision to save Christina, as well as the political impact that emerged after Christina's identity was erased from the world. We also witnessed an important meeting between Lena, Rio, and the people at Galark Castle that began to reveal the true rules about familiars and Rio's position as a transcendent being. In this part, the story is truly divided into two major focuses. On one side, there is an emotional confrontation and the revelation of major secrets regarding reincarnation, the familiar contract, and Lena's interference that shakes Rio's relationship with the people closest to him. On the other side, the political stage of the Bertram Kingdom begins to move through Duke Arbor's emergency meeting, which opens a new direction for the kingdom's strategy. Now, let us continue to Volume 28 Part 2. The story begins in the dining hall of Galark Castle, where all the residents of Rio's large household have gathered. King Francois and the Hiroaki group are sitting across from one another while waiting for Rio's arrival. Not long after that, Lena appears in the corner of the room while bringing Rio and Christina with her. Their sudden appearance immediately draws everyone's attention toward the three of them. Unlike Lena, who appears calm, the expressions on Rio and Christina's faces look complicated. When Flora sees that her older sister is still alive, she immediately runs forward and throws herself into Christina's arms, almost causing her to fall. While sobbing, Flora repeatedly hits Christina's chest, pouring out her protest because her sister left without saying anything and acted without thinking about her. Christina accepts that outburst while apologizing, then hugs Flora tightly in order to calm her down. A few minutes later, after Flora begins to calm down, Lena finally starts explaining the situation. She announces that Christina has now become a familiar, or in other words, Rio's absolute subordinate. Upon hearing that, Rio immediately tries to take all the blame. He explains that he arrived too late to save Christina at the execution stage. However, before he can finish his explanation, Lena interrupts and admits that she deliberately sabotaged the rescue attempt. She even calmly states that she intentionally arranged for Christina to be executed, because in her opinion, it would be far better for Christina to become Rio's subordinate. That confession instantly leaves everyone speechless. Sora, after hearing that explanation, immediately becomes furious. She stands up and is about to attack Lena, but Rio quickly stops her. Rio emphasizes that regardless of everything, the fact that he did not arrive on time to save Christina is true, and Christina's presence alive in this room is entirely thanks to Lena's intervention. Seeing Rio continue to blame himself, Christina immediately says that Rio is not at fault. Sora also adds that this chaos is clearly Lena's doing. In response to their anger, Lena merely snorts and sarcastically questions whether they truly want to waste time arguing about who is at fault. Christina then firmly states that this is not about finding someone to blame, but about the reason why Lena is so determined to make her Rio's subordinate that she is willing to sabotage the rescue. In response to that question, Lena lets out a cold laugh and explains that if Christina continues living as a member of the Bertram royal family, the future will change in an unpredictable direction. She ends her explanation by stating that Christina was supposed to die today, so everyone should be grateful that she is still alive. That explanation immediately triggers unease. Charlotte points out that they have been given far too little information to judge the truth of Lena's words. Satsuki also speaks up in a raised tone, urging Lena to provide a logical explanation. She emphasizes that without a proper explanation, it is impossible for them to trust her. However, Lena simply laughs and says that she is not trying to gain sympathy in the first place. She even mocks the idea of trust, saying that in the end, humans only feel satisfied when they get results that match their own desires. The atmosphere grows even more tense when Lena suddenly offers a compromise that sounds more like a threat. She challenges the group to immediately choose 4 more people to become Rio's familiars, so that they will not have to worry about those people dying in the future. Upon hearing that offer, Rio, who is usually gentle, suddenly shouts angrily. He condemns Lena for playing with other people's lives as if it is a form of blackmail. He points out that if they refuse to choose, then Lena herself will decide who will become the next familiar. In response to his anger, Lena instead questions whether immortality is truly a bad thing, since many humans actually desire it. Rio replies that eternal life without being able to interact with anyone is a curse. Lena casually suggests that they simply increase the number of followers so that they will not feel lonely. Not stopping there, Lena then reveals another fact, stating that the status of a familiar can actually be revoked. Upon hearing that, all the girls in the room are immediately shocked, and hope begins to rise that there might still be a way to save Christina's situation. However, that hope is immediately crushed when Lena explains the horrifying consequence. Canceling the contract means returning all the unpaid karma of the world. When Flora anxiously asks what will happen to her sister if the contract is released, Lena answers without hesitation that Christina will most likely die instantly. That is because her heart had already been removed during the contract process in order to prevent her death at that time. Lena then adds that Rio and Christina might be a special case. She explains that a subordinate is heavily influenced by their master. If Sora can transform into a dragon human because her master is the Dragon King, then Christina's fate might also be different. Rio himself is no longer a Dragon King, but a human who has become a transcendent entity after assimilating with the spirit Aisha. Because of that, Lena is not even certain whether Rio and Christina are truly immortal or not. That explanation leaves everyone stunned. However, before they can fully process that information, Lena suddenly declares that her business is finished. She immediately releases the transformation magic on her earring, and in an instant, her appearance changes back into Miharu. Miharu's body immediately goes limp in her chair. Sora, who is still filled with anger, quickly grabs and shakes her, demanding that Lena return and finish the conversation. However, Miharu, who has just regained consciousness, looks confused and does not understand what is happening at all. After Sora is calmed down, Miharu finally learns about the situation. She explains that her body is often forcibly taken over whenever she suddenly feels sleepy. She also admits that she cannot communicate with Lena at all. Upon hearing that explanation, everyone can only sigh in frustration. King Francois, who has been silent until now, finally speaks. He questions the future of Princess Christina and the movements of the Restoration Organization. Without hesitation, Christina shakes her head and firmly declares that Princess Christina of the Bertram Kingdom no longer exists. From now on, she will live only as Christina, who is Rio's subordinate. Christina then turns toward Flora and points to her younger sister to lead the organization as the first princess. That decision clearly makes Flora panic. She feels that it is impossible for her to replace her sister's position. Gently, Christina calms Flora and assures her that she does not need to become anyone's replacement. She only needs to be herself. She also promises that she will continue to support Flora from behind as long as she remains in this country. Even though Flora is still crying and insists that she cannot replace her sister, Christina continues to reassure her that responsibility will naturally shape a person. As the new first princess, Flora will surely be able to lead. Christina also adds that she is very proud to have a younger sister like Flora. Those sincere words cause Flora's emotional defenses to collapse once again, and she cries in her sister's arms until she finally truly calms down. That long discussion eventually comes to an end. It is decided that Flora and Christina will stay at Rio's mansion. Rio then escorts the two sisters to a room inside the mansion. After seeing them off, Rio immediately heads to his own room. Even though he knows that there are still people in the dining hall, he has no intention of returning there. His feelings are in turmoil, and he feels that interacting with others will only make the situation even more difficult. He truly needs time alone. Without the pressure of the people around him, the emotions that he has been holding back finally surface. The cause is clear. He cannot come to terms with the fact that Christina has now become his subordinate. Even though he does not regret his decision to let Christina live, he also cannot force himself to feel happy with an ending like this. However, suddenly there is a knock from behind the door. Rio tries to put on a calm expression before opening it. To his surprise, it is Miharu standing there. Rio is immediately startled and asks whether Miharu has come alone. He suspects that the figure in front of him might actually be Lena in disguise. Seeing Rio looking at her with suspicion, Miharu suddenly steps back and lowers her head deeply while apologizing. Confused, Ryo immediately asks why she is apologizing. With a trembling voice and deep guilt, Miharu explains that while she was unconscious, Lena used her body to do terrible things that cannot be undone. Hearing the sincerity in her voice, Ryo finally becomes convinced that the person standing before him truly is Miharu. However, his heart wavers when he remembers how Lena, in Miharu's form, once blocked his path in the sky above the capital of the Bertram Kingdom. The image of Lena overlapping with Miharu's face makes Ryo unable to look directly into Miharu's eyes. Miharu tries to apologize again, but Ryo firmly refuses. He emphasizes that Miharu and Lena are two different entities, so Miharu does not need to bear any responsibility. Even so, deep in his heart, Ryo realizes that the future created by Lena is almost flawless. Christina managed to secure a political agreement by sacrificing her life, and if Ryo had forcibly stopped the execution, it would most likely have brought an even greater disaster to the Bertram Kingdom. However, that logic is still unable to calm his feelings. His mind continues to be filled with regret. Ryo realizes that Christina must have been very afraid of facing death, yet she still chose to sacrifice herself for her country. He remembers the rainy night in the garden when Christina embraced him and asked for courage. At that time, Christina had most likely already made her decision, but she could not directly ask for help. Ryo deeply regrets that he was not sensitive to that sign and did not discuss it more deeply beforehand. He continues to blame himself, imagining that if only he had responded earlier to Lena's suggestion to make Christina his subordinate in a proper way, perhaps the final outcome would not have been this bitter. Seeing Ryo standing there in silence with a pale face, Miharu calls out to him in a worried tone. Ryo snaps out of his thoughts and quickly apologizes for spacing out. Seeing that Miharu is still burdened by a sense of responsibility over something that she cannot even control, makes Ryo feel extremely frustrated. Driven by emotion, Ryo suddenly grabs both of Miharu's shoulders, stares closely into her face, and firmly begs her to stop blaming herself. That sudden action makes Miharu's body tremble in shock, and she can only nod. Realizing that he has gone too far, Ryo immediately releases his hands and apologizes. Miharu's cheeks instantly turn red, and she quickly looks away. In order to break the awkward atmosphere, Miharu then asks why Lena chose her among everyone. Ryo is slightly surprised and asks whether Miharu has not heard the reason yet. When Miharu shakes her head in confusion and asks whether Ryo knows something, Ryo hesitates. He warns her that the truth is quite horrifying, then makes sure whether Miharu is truly ready to hear it. Miharu slowly nods. Ryo then begins to explain. He says that even if the Dragon King and Lena had not used reincarnation magic, the figures of Amakawa, Haruto, and Miharu would still have been born on Earth. However, if the Dragon King had not used reincarnation magic, Haruto would have been destined to die in a traffic accident. Without Haruto's memories entering Ryo's body in this world, Ryo himself would also have been destined to die tragically in the slums. That explanation immediately shocks Miharu. Ryo then continues describing the future that was supposed to happen. He explains that without Lena's intervention, Haruto would die, Ryo would die, and Miharu's fate would have been far worse. Without Haruto's reincarnation, Miharu would have been destined to become a slave after being caught in the hero summoning, and she would have eventually died miserably without ever being saved. Hearing that series of facts, Miharu's face immediately contorts in pain. Trembling, she begins to realize that Haruto was essentially reincarnated only to protect her from that fate. Ryo confirms that. He explains that Lena deliberately foresaw the future and reincarnated Haruto in order to protect Miharu. He also adds that Lena chose Miharu not only to protect her, but also because of Miharu's extremely large magical capacity. When Miharu hesitantly asks what he means, Ryo's face is once again filled with inner conflict. Lena's words at the execution stage echo in his head, questioning whether he is capable of killing Miharu. At that moment, Ryo realizes Lena's true scheme. That entity deliberately planted Haruto's memories within him as a final insurance, because Lena knows that Haruto would never be able to harm Miharu. If the memories that had been planted were those of another reincarnated Dragon King, perhaps Ryo would not have hesitated. Seeing Ryo lowering his head in silence with a deeply tormented expression, Miharu gently touches his arm in concern and says that he does not need to force himself to continue speaking. When Rio looks at Miharu's face, the image of Lena's cunning smile seems to overlap with the innocent face of the girl before him. For a brief moment, he even suspects that the figure in front of him is Lena in disguise. After a short silence, Rio forces a stiff smile and asks Miharu to return to the dining hall for now. Even though she appears to want to say something more, Miharu finally obeys and leaves the room. After Miharu leaves, Rio stands alone in silence until Aisha suddenly reveals her form. Without saying anything, Aisha steps closer and immediately embraces Rio. The warmth of that embrace slowly eases the anxiety, fear, and guilt that have been pressing on his heart. When Rio lowers his head in resignation and softly asks what is happening, Aisha calmly reassures him that the girl who just left truly is Miharu, not Lena. Hearing that, Rio gives a small, self-mocking smile and says thank you. He then asks Aisha to allow him to remain in her embrace a little longer, at least until he is truly ready to face everyone again. Meanwhile, far from Rio's location, in the capital of the Bertram Kingdom, specifically inside the castle cabinet room, a high-level emergency meeting is taking place. Because the king is absent, all the important figures from Duke Arbor's faction have gathered. At the head of the table, Duke Arbor sits as chairman in the seat of honor. The atmosphere in the room is chaotic, as the ministers and the Night Order blame each other for their failure to stop the kidnapper in the capital's main square. However, due to the absolute effect of the divine rules related to the transcendent, everyone's memories regarding Rio and Christina have been completely erased and manipulated. The ministers now believe that the incident was a staged public execution of First Princess Flora. They are convinced that the real Flora is in the Galark Kingdom, so the execution was merely a tactic using a substitute prisoner to lure out domestic troublemakers. The debate continues without direction. Amid the uproar, the Minister of War, who sits near Duke Arbor, tries to calm the situation. However, the ministers and knights only blame one another more intensely, and they even begin accusing Duke Huguenot of cooperating with the Restoration faction. Duke Huguenot immediately denies the accusation firmly. He emphasizes that he has already left the Restoration and knows absolutely nothing about this incident. However, the ministers continue to pressure and corner him. In response to the suspicion, Duke Huguenot explains that the intruder displayed an absurd level of combat strength. If the Restoration truly possessed a fighter that powerful, they would certainly have used that person as their spearhead during the previous attack on Rodania. He also reminds them that he himself was the one who drove a spear into the enemy's heart at that time. Hearing that explanation, the ministers fall silent because they realize that the logic of his argument makes sense. They then begin linking this incident to the figure who once kidnapped Celia during her wedding to Charles. As soon as that name is mentioned, Charles becomes furious. He proposes that they launch another attack on Rodania and capture Princess Flora. The ministers immediately agree with that proposal. Charles then turns to his father, Duke Arbor, who has been silent the entire time, and asks for a decision. After a long silence, Duke Arbor finally speaks. He declares that they will not attack Rodania. That unexpected decision instantly causes the entire room to fall silent. Charles, shocked, immediately questions the reason. Duke Arbor reminds him of the 10-year non-aggression pact that they agreed upon with the Restoration, on the condition that the regalia would be returned. However, Charles objects. He argues that they are the victors, so the defeated side does not have the right to demand anything. Charles believes that there is no reason to continue honoring that agreement. His opinion immediately gains support from the ministers. Duke Arbor immediately scolds his son for that way of thinking. He stresses that the agreement was officially ratified in the presence of the King of Galark. If they dare to violate it and ignore the punishment, that would be the same as challenging the Galark Kingdom and making that great nation their enemy. Furthermore, Duke Arbor questions the urgency of such an attack. He challenges anyone in the room to provide a reasonable explanation as to why they cannot wait 10 years until the restriction period is lifted. However, not a single person dares to answer. After dealing with the internal issue, Duke Arbor shifts to a new strategy to confront the Restoration. He decides that instead of using violence, they will pursue diplomacy over the next 10 years with the ultimate goal of dissolving the organization. That heavy responsibility is immediately assigned to Duke Huguenot in his role as Minister of the Interior. with Count Claire serving as his assistant. That decision immediately sparks whispers among the ministers. Duke Huguenot himself appears surprised. Hesitantly, he expresses his concern that the negotiations will be extremely difficult, considering his status as a former member who is now branded a traitor by the Restoration. He also questions why the task was not given to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, since this matter will likely involve travel to the Bertram Kingdom. However, Duke Arbor dismisses that objection. He firmly states that the Restoration is fundamentally a domestic rebellion issue, so the matter is entirely the responsibility of the Ministry of the Interior. Duke Huguenot then bows deeply and promises to give his best effort for the future of the kingdom. The emergency meeting is finally adjourned. After the cabinet room becomes quiet again, and only Duke Arbor and his son Charles remain, he immediately scolds Charles harshly, telling him not to be easily deceived by the ministers. According to him, when those politicians loudly speak about the interests of the organization, that is precisely when Charles should become suspicious that they are pursuing personal gain. Hearing that reprimand, Charles can only lower his head. Charles then hesitantly expresses his concern. He questions his father's decision to entrust the negotiations to Duke Huguenot, who has only recently defected. He fears that this will instead worsen the rivalry between factions within the cabinet. In response, Duke Arbor explains that his support for Duke Huguenot is deliberately intended as a counterbalance to restrain the influence of the other faction. He then looks sharply at his son and asks whether Charles truly does not realize the hidden intentions of the ministers during the meeting. Charles replies that he believes the ministers simply want to conquer Rodania in order to achieve success. Hearing that, Duke Arbor immediately calls his son foolish. He explains that the true ambition of the Minister of War is to take control of Rodania for personal interest. Charles briefly argues that when they first seized the territory, the ministers did not demand any rights. However, Duke Arbor explains that the situation was different at that time, because the achievement primarily belonged to the Arbor family. Now that Rodania has been returned, the ministers see a new opportunity. He also adds that the ministers deliberately brought up the matter of Charles's former fiancée, Celia, merely to provoke his emotions and manipulate him into supporting the attack plan. Duke Arbor then concludes his advice with a stern warning. He says that the position of Prime Minister and the status of high nobility are not secure forever. If Charles or his descendants become weak one day, the prosperity of the Arbor family could collapse instantly. Understanding the weight of that responsibility, Charles nods seriously. After that, Duke Arbor tells him to leave, and Charles exits the room. After his son leaves, Duke Arbor leans back in his chair. While staring at the ceiling, he reflects on his fate. He has worked extremely hard to build his faction and climb to the peak of power. However, after reaching that height, he sees a bitter reality. He realizes how lonely it is at the top, where every decision made for the common good always provokes hatred from those who think only about personal profit. He is also aware of the heavy price that has been paid to build that power. Practices such as nepotism, corruption, and bribery were indeed effective in eliminating rivals such as the Huguenot camp in the past, but their impact is now beginning to damage the kingdom. Important positions are filled by incompetent individuals, the quality of governance declines, talented people are pushed aside, and the risk of betrayal grows greater. Even regional tax revenue has begun to decrease due to rampant embezzlement, slowly weakening the strength of the nation. Amid his frustration at seeing his faction members who only want to enrich themselves, Duke Arbor's thoughts suddenly return to a mysterious voice that once warned him that the future of the nation cannot be built through internal conflict. That voice said that the true purpose of a ruler is not to divide the people for the sake of factions, but to unite the country for the sake of all its citizens. Duke Arbor tries to remember who the charismatic figure was who once said those words. Ironically, he cannot remember the face or the name of that girl at all. However, a sense of respect and guilt still lingers in his heart. Realizing that he has gone too far and has pushed many people aside for the sake of his ambition, Duke Arbor strengthens his resolve that there is no path to retreat. He must restore the national strength that is beginning to collapse. If politics continues to rot, the Proxia Empire will certainly take advantage of that weakness to launch an attack. Even though he knows that he will face strong resistance from within his own faction, Duke Arbor remains determined to reform the state system and change his approach. beginning with a peaceful step toward the restoration. With firm steps, he finally stands up and leaves the room, heading to his office to meet Duke Huguenot, preparing to draft a negotiation strategy for the future of the Bertram Kingdom. So, that is the recap of Part 2 from Volume 28 of the light novel Spirit Chronicles. What do you think? It is interesting, is it not? In the midst of the chaos caused by Lena's interference and the major secret of reincarnation that has finally been revealed, Rio must face an even heavier emotional burden, while the political stage of Bertram begins moving in a direction that is no less dangerous. For now, it feels like there is nothing more that needs to be explained, because everything is already pointing toward an even greater development in the next part.